one is obviously deployment frequency, right? But there's also the lead time for changes. How long how quickly are you able to respond to changes that customers ask you to do? Because sometimes, let's face it, even our customers don't always know exactly what they want unless you get it in increments, right? So when they do see the first iteration, they say, okay, this is not exactly what I needed, and that's fundamentally what Scrum and Agile allows you to do. How quickly can you respond to those changes? But that's what dynamism really is. That's what organizational and technical agility really means, right? And then when things do go wrong, and just because we've adopted Agile or waterfall or water agile or whatever combination suits your organization, doesn't mean you're not going to have failures. You will still have failures. The question is, how quickly can you get up when you've been knocked down? And that's a key measure of our success. It's not just deployment frequency. And fourthly, but last but not least, can you reduce the number of those failures, right? So can you treat it as a system level problem where you prevent downstream issues from flowing through? So after having gone through, so these were really the summary of the key learnings that we've had in the past, in the last 6 to 9 months. And what we have seen is, after having taken a few missteps, learned, course corrected along the way, we have seen improvements in the way our customers view what we are producing for them. Right? And this varies in pockets. Different pockets within GE Healthcare have seen different bang for the buck. But fundamentally what we've seen is, this is something that we've talked to the healthcare team and the digital team in other parts of the business, is about a 21% increase in software quality, and also about a 72% increase in a reduction in IT spend. Right? What we are also trying to do is, and this number is debatable because hard to measure, but a lot of it is qualitative feedback, is we do believe that embracing Agile and DevOps has led to focusing on a reduction in waste, including meeting time. Right? People, like everywhere else, when you're doing stand-ups, you tend to be a lot more crisper than when you're sitting down. Right? So I think panel discussion should be done standing up, as a case in point. But that fundamentally creates ways to reduce waste, and hence you create capacity for innovation. It's not that we hired more people because of Agile. It's just that we found ways to make them more effective and cut down on stuff that was fundamentally unnecessary. Though we are nowhere close to where we should be. Right? And this is really not emblematic of the larger organization. This is probably pockets. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you measure the innovation capacity, which is 8x?
So I think, we're looking at a lot of things. One is the patent volume. Two is how many awards we win, and what stuff that was not part of our initial program plan. When we sign up for such a big bang project, you have certain things within scope. Then you add stuff that was not necessarily something that was articulated by a customer as internal initiatives, if you will, which then translated to pull-through sales. So there's a lot of ways to measure those things, right? So that's why I said it varies from group to group. There's no standard metric that we do have. So take this with a pinch of salt. Right? But that's an example of what we do in some places. Okay. The one thing that I did want to touch upon is one aspirational goal that we do have is, can we reduce the cycle time? Going back to that first slide where we talked about improving developer experience, what does that mean really? A simple way to measure it is, can we really get down the cycle time for a developer to push his or her changes to a production environment? Whether we actually ship it to a customer or not is a separate function, because we have other process-related stuff to take care of. But can we make sure that the developer in question is absolved of his or her primary responsibilities within a day, as opposed to 2 months? And we're not there yet, right? But this is really where we want to go. So now what we did was, we obviously, once you define your objectives, the why, you started with the why, that was our first slide. Then we start to get into how are we going to measure them. Right? So the important thing to do is define what you want to measure, because measurement drives behavior, as you all know. Right? Measurement and incentives drive behavior. So if you can tie your measurement systems to the incentives of human beings, invariably drives the behaviors that are either desirable or undesirable. Right? So that's exactly what we're trying to do. Marry the metrics to what outcomes we want to achieve. But the important thing again here is, there are, as much as you start to focus on metrics, be aware of the fact that these can be gamed. Pretty much anything that can be measured is amenable to being gamed. Right? So it's also just as important to focus on the immeasurably important or the intangible factors, like what's team health, and we'll touch upon that in a little bit. Right? Also, the other thing I would like to point out is here you can either measure things that confirm what you want to believe. So let's say I set out those objectives about quality, responsiveness, velocity, and creating a thriving third-party ecosystem. If I'm looking for things that confirm that, you know what, we're doing a great job, I can get you enough metrics that do that. The important thing is to be able to look for metrics that disconfirm what you're looking for. And going back to that conversation around culture. So it starts with what you're measuring. So look for stuff that says this may not be exactly what you're doing, and don't look for things that look green. Look for things that look red. And then when those radiators come up, this is where the third most important attribute comes in. What do leaders do with that information? Right? How you respond to bad news is going to be a key determinant of whether this thing succeeds or not. Otherwise, you could have all the traffic lights in the world, and it would care for nothing. So a large part of what we've been trying to do is inculcate that training amongst our leadership team to say, hey, when there's bad news flashing, because now you removed the slide where it's information radiating straight from the source. If it's green, it's green. If it's red, it's red. Are you going to shoot the messenger? Are you going to ding the team or the individual? Then the next time you're going to find this all green, right? People are going to find ways to make it green, right? So are you going to look for ways to work with them, make them feel that you're part of that problem and the solution, and roll up your sleeves, and it doesn't matter whether you're an SVP or a CEO, can you solve the problem for the team? And that's the hardest part of the whole metric aspect of it that we want to touch upon. That's one other key learning. And we've not gotten that right. We're hoping to get that right over time. This was the other part. So there are things, like I said, which cannot be measured, but they are immeasurably important. And so this, again, thanks to my friend Eben, is something that we borrowed from Spotify. Right? So we're just experimenting. It's a nascent stage experimentation that we're carrying out with some of other teams, where before the start of a retrospective, they're being asked by whoever's leading the retrospective, hey, the metrics look great and all of that. That's the previous slide. But what's your sense? How is it impacting your experience for the better or for the worse? And if it's not, what do you think we should change? Because that really, if you think about it, is the essence of a retrospective, isn't it? Right? So this is something that Spotify kickstarted, but I think we're trying to see if it works for us. And if it doesn't work, we'll either modify it or throw it away and try something else. Because again, I'll borrow shamelessly from Evan. I think if you think about Agile, it's really a bend, not the end. Right? It's a means to an end. And you've got to keep the end in mind always. So what we're hoping to do is now, where we really stand, and the slide's not coming out great in this, sorry about that, or I can talk to it, is we are in really phase one of what we call the DevOps migration tool for all of our 1,600 plus engineers. The intent is to be able to migrate from a waterfall to a partly agile process or a fully agile process, embrace DevOps in toto, and then be able to do that at large scale. And we're finding issues as we scale to a large team. So that's something that we're working through with our operations guys, with IT team. And our definition of success would be, have we hit the quality metrics, the speed metrics that we've initially identified. But once we do that, what we really want to get to is what we call cognitive DevOps, where now you start getting the data from all of these tools. You get data, both anecdotal evidence and quantifiable data. How do you start building algorithms and bring in things like AI that can act on this data and identify bottlenecks? So you don't just use AI for customer-facing stuff. Can you use AI on the data that's coming out of your internal tooling systems to be able to pinpoint hotspots and then target them? Right, so that's really what we're going after. So to be able to summarize fundamentally, right, the key takeaway that you should really have is, A, look at this as a system level problem, if you're a leader, at whatever level you may be, and try and see how you can prevent issues or responsibilities from being pushed downstream. That's really something that we figured, and a lot of that has to do with cultural training, or retraining, or unlearning, like we were talking about earlier. Second is make sure the people who are closest to the customers and the people who are building the code or testing the code have a very tight feedback loop. And the bigger the company, the more successful the company, the harder this problem is to crack. right? Even within GE Healthcare and within imaging, we've got a platform team that's central, that builds artifacts that serves other businesses, and we've got individual businesses like the CT business, the X-ray business. And how do you make sure that they work and collaborate, which has improved significantly because of the way we've started to organize team structures. But there's again room for improvement, and I'm sure you'll have remnants of that in your respective organization. That's again key, making sure that you create a feedback loop. And then lastly, how do you make it incremental? How do you make the feedback loop tight? Because for those of you who play sports, you know that the reason sports is so effective in teaching you to get better is the feedback loops are almost instantaneous. You hit a bad shot, you know it right away. And what DevOps and Agile allows you to do is create those tight feedback loops, right? And lastly, on the what I would say, I would really end by saying that what I would strongly suggest is actively seek being open-minded. And a lot of people misunderstand what being open-minded is. They think, being open-minded is listening to other people's feedback and listening to it. That's a start. But I would say that actively looking for where you could be wrong. Because the irony really is, the more actively you seek where you're being wrong, the more likely you are in actually being right in the longer term. Right? And then the tragedy for most of us is not that we aim too high and we miss it, but usually that we aim too low and we end up hitting it. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Right. Any questions, anything that you want to share, experience on? What have you changed your mind about? Right. Go ahead.
One question. So when you started the DevOps journey, was it mostly for the engineering side of it in terms of your development excellency, or also in terms of a deployment at the customer side? What was your key driver for DevOps?
Great question. So it's actually a little bit of both. Like I said, if you go back to the first slide, we did want to improve the developer experience because those were our internal customers. We view them as our internal customers. But truth be told, equally important criteria was our ability to respond to customer requests. It could be small feature requests that don't require massive amount of change, or it could be critical issues which really you don't want to wait too long, like security vulnerabilities, whatever it may be. How do you make sure that you can respond to both reactive problems as well as you can delight them, both external customers and internal customers? So it was fairly equally weighted. That's why if you look at our original whys, the third part was creating an application ecosystem, which is the third stakeholder. So there's customers, there's internal developers, and there's our partners, the people, the third-party developers who we want to partner with. These were the three stakeholders we wanted to create a frictionless experience for. Go ahead. Yeah.
GE is known for GE is known for mainly Six Sigma implementation, if you look at it. Okay. So how did it, fit into the Agile when we started implementing it?
Okay, that's a great question. So I don't actually view these two as mutually exclusive. If you take what is the fundamental essence of Six Sigma, right? It's about being able to eliminate defects and being able to really attain a high quality bar. Now, if you treat that Agile as something that is synonymous with initially lower quality, yes, those are conflicting priorities. But I think the way you should look at both Agile and DevOps is not necessarily starting with a lower quality bar and then iterating your way successfully approximating to something that's close to perfect, but take a thin slice of what you want to build, but don't compromise on quality for that thin slice. Right? Rather than building a 4-lane road up front, pick one lane, do a really good job of it. Right? And you can be Six Sigma or even higher there, and then learn from what worked and what didn't, because even if you're Six Sigma with the original requirements, customers may learn something new. So when you're building the second, the third, and the fourth lane, you may do something differently. So that's why it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but great question.
Hi. Yeah. So what has been your approach, because each of the product ecosystem is at different maturity level in terms of the DevOps. There will be legacy application which is maybe 20 years behind, Yes. They started with waterfall model and then moving to Agile. So what has been your approach in terms of prioritizing, in terms of the movement actually?
Sure. Again, a good question. So this was something that we've wrestled with for a while before we decided how to approach it. So we took the approach of starting with work that's relatively greenfield first, and making sure that we learn, because we didn't want to, this allows us to take a smaller team that's more open to trying things out, because remember, this is a company that's successful, and to your point, has had products that have a long gestation period in the field. Some of these things we still support after 20 years. So rather than going after that segment, you start the transformation by picking the people who are most likely to evangelize these new approaches, which is greenfield projects, younger teams, people like me, extremely young, right? And then you learn a few things along the way, and then you can expand that. And ultimately, so to specifically answer your question, what we're doing is in 2018, going after greenfield projects. In 2019, we're looking at migration of existing products in the field to at least the next releases of the existing products in the field to a completely DevOps agile. But time will tell. We don't intend to touch the older releases that are only bug fix only, right? We don't intend to touch them. Currently, so again, no, so the way you should look at that is, when I gave you that answer, it was in the context of one part of GE Healthcare. There's other parts of GE Healthcare that have been, especially if you look at cloud-based teams, etc., that have moved en masse. So some of those metrics are true for their entire portfolio. Right.
Can this methodology be used for hardware function operations management in any way?
It is harder, and I wouldn't claim to it, but it's definitely not impossible, because if you look at adoption of Agile, a lot of the digital industrial companies, not just GE, but even I'm sure our peers, I don't have first-hand information about things like Honeywell, and even companies like Boeing and Airbus, they also use Agile and DevOps very, very effectively. And they are significantly hardware-centric, and they build really complex pieces of hardware. The part that you've got to figure out is, when you have a hardware plus software program, is how do you do the thin slicing so that, one, it's harder to change hardware, right? You can't go out and tell a fab plant that, hey, you know what, I made a mistake, so let's iterate. So you've got to be able to identify the high consequence, irreversible decisions and see how you could do the appropriate amount of due diligence for those before you go into a sprint-based model. And for things that have relatively lower consequence and reversible, even in the hardware plus software space, you could learn and then iterate. And so I think you've got to create that risk profile, risk reversibility and consequence metrics, and then pick your battles there.
Actually, what you just told regarding hardware, Intel across the street is one of the biggest implementations.
Good there? Great. Excellent. This is exactly what I wanted. I wanted you guys to share your experiences.
And then immediate customers are there. Their laptops.
So let me ask you guys a question, right? So we shared what we learned along the way. So I'm sure a lot of y'all are leading software transformations, Agile, DevOps in your organizations. What have you changed your mind on in the last 6 months or 1 year? What have you learned, which you thought was...
So one of the gentlemen talked about Six Sigma and then Agile transformation. To our organization, and specifically for me, Six Sigma is mostly on the quality side of it, nothing related to execution side of it. And agility is about being effective. So wherever there are organizations who are looking at efficiency side of it, on the manufacturing side, so it might not really fit in well, because they look at efficiency. Agile is mostly about effectiveness. So we being in software development company, we look mostly on the effective side of it. That is where we complement more and then see a lot of value coming of agility.
Okay, thank you.
One last question.
Okay, sure.
No, my question is, when to adopt, or what are the compelling factors to bring in DevOps into, we are agile team, but we don't see, we'll have production releases after 2 sprints together, done by the same development team. But what is, as you said, if you are having some 10 deployments or 20 deployments, that's a myth actually, per day, so you have to go for, or at what point of time you have to think about DevOps introduction, or what are the compelling factors to bring in?
Yeah, so again, it merits a longer conversation. I think we need to understand the specific context of the organization and the phase they are in. But to us, it was fairly, like I was mentioning earlier, what we wanted to do was, we want to be able to create a mechanism by which you can distribute both software or hardware, whatever we are shipping to our customers, sooner than we have in the past. and also do it in a way with predictability, right? Because we are a large company. We have people operating at different sites, different degrees of experience. So how do you ensure we are both automation and pipelining? Because if you think about DevOps from a technical standpoint, you're creating a pipeline, right? And you're bringing doses of automation at every stage in the pipeline. So that allows you to, going back to that first slide, when you talk about consistency at a global scale, this is another means to be able to achieve that. Right? And the last thing is we've done external and internal benchmarking with companies of our size, our competitors, people in other industries, and we've seen that the downside risk relative to the upside risk, the ROI for adopting DevOps for our classes of problems of what we wanted to solve was very, very high. The downside risk is almost very, very low, whereas the upside is pretty high. So it really it was a no-brainer decision for us to adopt DevOps, right, in the context of the organization that we were in. But we can definitely talk maybe later once I understand your specific organization context.
Because whether
but it's not for, I don't think we can make a blanket statement that
DevOps
now is the right time.
or it might not be for all organizations. So that was the inference.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to answer this question. What is the experience?
Basically, I was coordinating Scrum of Scrums and Scrums, and the teams were all working cooperatively. But when it came to the final, towards the end of the release, suddenly people changed their hat to waterfall, and then they said the Scrum of Scrum is not needed now, because now it has gone into bug mode. So, even the top management immediately removes Scrum of Scrum. They approve it instantaneously. So that was some of the learnings. So I thought, okay, let me be flexible instead of just objecting. So that was one thing. And then, unless there is a cultural change, that the observation that I had is, okay, unless there is a sweeping cultural change, these bits and pieces of implementation is just going to be like mere experimentation.
Great. Thank you, Vignesh. It sounds like you have a good agile coach in GE.
This part of the program was sponsored by everybody.
Okay. So I invite John DeVries to come and present a momento to Vignesh for the wonderful enlightening talk.
So,